I remember when they first started laughing at me and Rex at the county auction that humid Tuesday morning in July. A 73-year-old mechanic inheriting what looked like a rust bucket from my late brother-in-law shouldn't have surprised anyone in Millfield, Nebraska, but the snickering from the younger crowd still stung like salt in an open wound. Rex, my 8-year-old German Shepherd mix with one ear that never quite stood straight, pressed his warm flank closer to my leg as we stood there examining the 1967 Chevrolet C10 that Harold had left me. The truck's original blue paint had surrendered to decades of Nebraska weather, leaving behind patches of rust that bloomed like orange flowers across the metal. The bed was littered with empty Budweiser cans, cigarette butts, and what looked like the remains of a tarp that had been shredded by wind and time. "That old fool's gonna need a tow truck just to get that heap home," someone muttered behind us, and I felt my shoulders tense the way they always did when people dismissed something before they understood it. But Rex's ears perked up in that alert way that meant he'd caught something important, and he started sniffing around the driver's side door with unusual intensity, his black nose working overtime as he traced invisible scent trails that only he could follow. I'd learned to trust Rex's instincts over the years. He'd been the one to alert me when Mrs. Henderson's cat was trapped in her basement, and he'd growled at Danny Martinez's stepfather a full minute before the rest of us realized the man was drunk and looking for trouble. The morning air carried the familiar smells of a rural auction, diesel fuel from the tractors, coffee from the concession stand, and that particular mixture of dust and hope that hung around places where people came to buy pieces of other people's lives. I'd been coming to these auctions for 20 years, ever since Margaret and I had started collecting antique tools for the garage. She'd always had an eye for hidden value, could spot a genuine Stanley plane or a pristine set of wrenches among the junk that others overlooked. Standing there looking at Harold's truck, I wondered what she would have seen that I was missing. I'd been working on engines since I was 14, learning from my father in our family garage on 2nd Street before it got swallowed up by the chain stores that moved into town in the 80s. 60 years of grease under my fingernails, 60 years of coaxing life back into dying machines, 60 years of understanding that every mechanical problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. These young mechanics with their computer diagnostic tools and their certainty that anything older than 20 years belonged in a scrapyard, they thought they knew better. But I'd rebuilt engines that their grandfathers had given up on, had brought transmissions back to life that had been declared terminal by men half my age. Harold had been my wife Margaret's brother, a man who kept to himself after Vietnam and never married, never settled into the kind of comfortable routine that defined most lives in our small town. We'd shared maybe a dozen real conversations in the 30 years I'd known him, mostly about carburetors and fishing spots along the Platte River, but also about the weight that some men carry from wars that ended decades ago. He'd lived in the same small house on Maple Street since 1971, working various jobs, janitor at the high school, night watchman at the grain elevator, maintenance man for the county, never staying anywhere long enough to put down real roots. When his lawyer called on a Wednesday evening to say Harold had left me the truck in his will, along with some tools and a few $100s, I figured it was his way of saying thanks for the times I'd helped him fix his mower or patch his roof without asking for payment. Margaret had been gone 2 years by then, cancer taking her slow and deliberate like everything else seemed to happen in our small town. The diagnosis had come on a Thursday in March, and by the following Christmas, I was learning how to live alone for the first time in 47 years. Our daughter Lisa lived in Omaha with her husband and my 2 grandsons, visiting every few weeks with carefully planned activities and cheerful conversation that couldn't quite hide her worry about how I was managing. The house felt hollow most days, full of echoes and memories that sometimes felt more real than my actual present. I'd taken to talking to Margaret's photograph on the mantel, updating her on neighborhood gossip and garage business as if she might respond with one of her knowing smiles. Rex had been Margaret's idea originally, adopted from the county shelter when she first got sick, thinking a dog might give us both something to focus on besides doctors and treatments and the terrible mathematics of time running out. She'd chosen him specifically because he was older, already past the puppy phase, and because something in his amber eyes reminded her of the way I looked when I was concentrating on a particularly stubborn engine problem. After she passed, Rex became my shadow, following me to the garage every morning at 7:30, lying on his old army blanket while I worked on whatever broken-down vehicle someone had brought in, hoping I could resurrect it one more time. He had this way of knowing things before I did, like when Mrs. Henderson's transmission was starting to slip weeks before the first symptoms appeared, or when young Danny Martinez was lying about how he'd really put that dent in his father's pickup truck. Rex would get a certain look in his eyes, a focused intensity that meant he was processing information that hadn't reached my conscious mind yet. Margaret used to say he was psychic, but I think he just paid attention to details that people missed. The slight change in an engine's rhythm, the tension in someone's voice when they weren't telling the whole truth, the way a person's body language shifted when they were hiding something important. The day I brought Harold's truck home, Rex wouldn't settle. He kept circling the vehicle like he was checking its perimeter for threats, whining low in his throat, pawing at the passenger door with a persistence that bordered on obsession. I figured he was picking up Harold's scent, maybe some anxiety I was giving off about taking on another project at my age, when my arthritis was already making simple tasks more difficult than they used to be. The truck ran, barely, coughing black smoke and grinding through the gears like it was chewing gravel, but it had enough life in it to make the 15-mile journey from the auction house to my property behind the garage. I parked it next to the barn where I kept my collection of project cars, a 1955 Ford that had been waiting for a new engine for 5 years, a Studebaker pickup that needed a complete electrical system overhaul, and Margaret's 1963 Mustang convertible that I couldn't bring myself to finish because completing it would mean accepting that she'd never drive it again. The truck looked at home among the other wounded vehicles, but Rex kept returning to it with an urgency that was starting to make me nervous. Every few hours he'd trot over to the Chevy, circle it once or twice, then come back to me with an expression that seemed to say, "You're missing something important." The neighbors who slowed down when they passed my place were probably wondering if the old man had finally lost his mind. Even Lisa called that evening, her voice careful and measured in the way it got when she was trying to manage my feelings without hurting them, asking if I was sure I wanted to take on another restoration project at this stage in my life. She didn't say what we both knew she was thinking, that maybe it was time for me to start scaling back instead of taking on new challenges, time to start thinking about assisted living and selling the garage and all the other gentle euphemisms for admitting that my best years were behind me. But Rex kept returning to that truck with a determination that reminded me of Margaret when she'd set her mind on something. Every morning when I let him out for his usual inspection of the property, he'd make a beeline for the Chevy, sniffing and circling, sometimes standing on his hind legs to peer through the windows with his paws pressed against the glass. I started paying closer attention to what had caught his interest, trying to see the truck through his senses instead of just my own assumptions about what Harold had left me. The interior was typical for an old work truck that had seen decades of hard use: cracked vinyl seats patched with duct tape, a faded dashboard where the sun had baked the plastic into a mottled gray, empty coffee cups wedged into crevices between the seats and the console. The radio was an aftermarket unit from the 80s, probably installed when the original had finally given up, and the floor mats were so worn I could see the metal underneath. But Rex kept focusing on the glove compartment, scratching at it with his paw, whining when I told him to get down, returning to it again and again like it held the answer to a question he couldn't quite formulate. I tried opening it the first day, but the latch was stuck solid, probably rusted shut from years of Nebraska humidity, and the kind of neglect that accumulates when someone stops caring about the small details of maintenance. Harold had never been particularly careful about things like that. His house was cluttered with half-finished projects and tools that needed cleaning, the kind of benign neglect that comes from having too much history and not enough energy to organize it all. I figured the glove compartment held the usual collection of registration papers and insurance cards, maybe some maps from before GPS made such things obsolete, nothing worth Rex's intense interest. After a week of his persistent attention to that compartment, I decided to take a closer look. I brought my tools out on a Saturday morning when the autumn air was crisp enough to make working outside pleasant, and carefully pried at the latch with a small screwdriver, not wanting to destroy whatever was inside if it turned out to be important. The metal groaned and resisted, corroded into place by time and weather, but finally gave way with a sharp crack that made Rex bark once, sharp and alert, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Inside was the usual collection of paperwork that accumulates in any vehicle over decades of ownership: registration papers and insurance cards, some going back to the 70s, expired inspection stickers, a few business cards for parts stores that had closed years ago. But underneath all that mundane documentation was something wrapped in old leather, the kind of careful preservation that suggested deliberate intent rather than casual storage. My hands were shaking slightly as I unwrapped it, Rex pressed against my leg, both of us somehow understanding that this moment mattered in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. The leather revealed a small metal box, the kind you might use to store fishing tackle or small tools, and inside that box was something that made my breath catch in my throat and my heart pound with a rhythm I hadn't felt since Margaret's diagnosis. Photographs, dozens of them, black and white images that looked like they'd been taken in the 40s or 50s, but these weren't family snapshots or vacation pictures. These were documentation photographs, the kind investigators take when they need to create an official record, showing what looked like stolen goods laid out on tables in careful arrangements, jewelry that sparkled even in the grainy photographs, silver pieces that looked old and valuable, art objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. And there were papers, typewritten reports with official-looking letterheads from organizations I didn't recognize, talking about recovered items and pending investigation and repatriation efforts in the formal language of bureaucracy. One name kept appearing in the documents, Heinrich Müller, and next to it, in Harold's careful handwriting, notes about dates and locations that meant nothing to me but clearly had significance for him. The dates ranged from 1946 to 1948, and there were references to displaced persons, camps, and cultural artifacts and investigations that seemed to have stretched on for years. I sat there in my garage with Rex beside me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, feeling like I'd stumbled into someone else's life by accident. Harold had never mentioned anything about being involved in investigations or law enforcement, but these documents suggested he'd been part of something significant, something that had required him to document and track valuable objects through a complex system that I didn't understand. There were lists of families, German names mostly, with addresses in what looked like refugee camps or temporary housing facilities, and next to each name was an inventory of items that seemed to belong to them. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. There were photographs of Harold himself, much younger in military uniform, standing next to other soldiers beside wooden crates and canvas-covered trucks, holding documents and pointing at objects laid out for inspection. The captions described these as repatriated cultural artifacts and recovered stolen property, and it was becoming clear that my brother-in-law had been part of the massive effort to return stolen Nazi loot to its rightful owners after the war. I'd read about such operations in history books, but I'd never imagined that someone in my own family had been involved in something so historically significant. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in another piece of old cloth, was a small notebook filled with Harold's handwriting, page after page of meticulous entries that read like a personal inventory. Each entry described items he'd encountered during his service: a silver menorah that had belonged to the Goldstein family of Munich, a painting of a woman in a blue dress that had hung in the Rosenberg home in Vienna, a set of candlesticks that had been wedding gifts to the Cones of Berlin. Some entries had check marks next to them, indicating items that had been successfully returned to their families, but others were marked with question marks, and a few were circled in red ink with notes that made my stomach clench with unease. As I read through the pages, Rex suddenly stood and walked to the truck's tailgate, whining in that specific way that meant he'd noticed something important. I followed him and saw what I'd missed before: scratches in the metal that looked deliberate, almost like someone had used a key or knife to mark coordinates or reference number. When I compared those scratches to some of the numbers in Harold's notebook, they matched perfectly, as if the truck itself had been turned into a kind of coded filing system. The realization that Harold had been carrying these secrets around with him for decades, literally driving them through town every day, made me feel dizzy with the weight of implications I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, I couldn't concentrate on the carburetor I was supposed to be rebuilding for Tom Peterson, a job that should have been routine after 40 years of similar repairs. Rex seemed to sense my distraction and kept bringing me different tools: a wrench when I needed a screwdriver, a hammer when I needed pliers, as if trying to help me focus, but my mind was spinning with questions about Harold and what he'd been involved in, and why he'd never said anything to any of us about his role in something so important. The weight of the secret felt enormous, like holding a piece of history that could change how people understood the past. I decided to call Lisa and ask if she remembered her uncle ever talking about the war, but she was in meetings all day at the insurance company where she worked as a claims adjuster. Instead, I drove into town and visited the library, where Mrs. Chen, the head librarian who'd been helping me research local history for years, assisted me in searching through old newspapers and military records that had been digitized and made available online. What I found made everything fall into place in a way that left me both proud of Harold's service and troubled by what seemed to be missing from the official record. Harold had been assigned to the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, a specialized unit of Allied forces working with a small team of soldiers and civilians tasked with tracking down and returning cultural treasures stolen by the Nazis during their occupation of Europe. The newspaper articles from 1947 mentioned him by name several times, describing how his unit had recovered millions of dollars worth of art and religious artifacts from hidden caches throughout Germany and Austria, working with refugee organizations to identify rightful owners and coordinate returns. The articles painted a picture of dedicated soldiers and civilians working to repair some of the cultural damage caused by the war, and Harold's name appeared in contexts that suggested he'd been particularly good at his job. But there was something else in those articles that caught my attention and made me understand why Harold had kept such detailed personal records. There were mentions of items that were never returned, pieces that went missing during the repatriation process, and investigations into black market sales of recovered goods. Some of the soldiers and civilians involved in the program had apparently been selling artifacts to private collectors instead of returning them to their rightful owners, and there had been several investigations and court-martial proceedings related to these thefts. Harold's name never appeared in connection with any wrongdoing, but his notebook suggested he'd been documenting irregularities that others had preferred to ignore. That evening, I spread everything out on my kitchen table: the photographs, the documents, Harold's notebook, and the printouts from the library, trying to piece together a story that had been hidden for 70 years. Rex lay at my feet, occasionally lifting his head when I moved something or made a sound of discovery, as if he understood that we were engaged in detective work that mattered more than our usual routine of mechanical repairs and evening walks. I was beginning to understand that Harold hadn't just been a soldier doing his duty. He'd been documenting something that troubled him deeply, keeping evidence of irregularities in the repatriation process that he'd never been able to resolve through official channels. Some of the items in the photographs were marked as returned to family in the official documents, but Harold's personal notes suggested they'd actually been sold to private collectors or simply disappeared into the confusion of post-war reconstruction. Names appeared in his notebook that I recognized from the newspaper society pages: wealthy local families who'd somehow acquired European art and jewelry in the years following the war, pieces that Harold's records suggested should have been returned to Jewish families who'd lost everything during the Holocaust. The Whitmore family, who owned the bank and most of the commercial real estate downtown, appeared several times in Harold's notes. According to his records, a painting that was supposed to be returned to the Rosenberg family of Munich had instead been marked as held pending verification with the Whitmore name written in the margin, along with a dollar amount that suggested a purchase rather than proper repatriation. The Hendersons, who'd owned the grain elevat for 3 generations, were connected to a set of silver pieces that should have gone to the Klein family of Vienna. Even the Petersons, whose son I'd been helping with mechanical work for years, appeared to have acquired items that Harold believed had been stolen from their rightful owners. The next few days I found myself driving past some of the addresses Harold had written down, nice houses in the better part of town where families had lived for generations, wondering what secrets might be hanging on their walls or locked in their safes. Rex rode with me on these drives, and I noticed he got agitated whenever we passed certain houses, particularly the Whitmore mansion on Elm Street with its perfectly manicured lawn and windows that reflected the sky like mirrors hiding what lay behind them. The Whitmores had been Millfield's most prominent family for as long as I could remember, their wealth so established that no one questioned where it had originally come from. Harold's notebook had several entries about items that were supposed to be returned to Jewish families who lost everything during the war, but were instead noted as held pending verification, with various local names written in the margins. The more I read, the more I understood that Harold had been trying to document a systematic theft that had been covered up by bureaucracy and the passage of time. Families who'd lost everything were waiting in displaced persons camps for the return of their cultural heritage, while American soldiers and civilians were selling those same items to collectors who didn't ask too many questions about provenance. I spent sleepless nights trying to decide what to do with what I'd discovered, lying in bed listening to Rex's steady breathing and trying to imagine what Margaret would have advised. Part of me wanted to just rebury the box and pretend I'd never found it, to let sleeping dogs lie, and avoid the complications that would inevitably follow if I tried to pursue justice for crimes that were 70 years old. Harold had kept these secrets for his entire adult life. Maybe he'd had good reasons for never bringing them forward. Maybe he'd understood something about the cost of truth that I was too naive to appreciate. But every time I looked at the photographs of those families in the displaced persons camps, faces marked by loss and hope in equal measure, I thought about what Margaret would have said. She'd always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it cost us money we couldn't afford or time we didn't have. She'd insisted on returning a wallet we'd found with $300 in it, even though we'd been struggling to pay our own bills that month. She'd made me confront a customer who'd been cheating on his taxes by understating the value of work I'd done for him, even though it meant losing his business. "Some things matter more than being comfortable," she used to say, and I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting next to me. Rex seemed to be pushing me forward too, bringing me the box whenever I tried to put it away, carrying Harold's notebook in his mouth and dropping it at my feet, as if he understood that some things couldn't stay buried indefinitely. Dogs have a sense of justice that's simpler and cleaner than human morality. They know when something is wrong, and they expect the pack leaders to do something about it. Rex had been trying to tell me about the truck's secrets from the beginning, and now that I'd found them, he seemed to expect me to act on what I'd learned. I finally decided to call the FBI office in Omaha, not sure they'd even be interested in something so old, but knowing I had to try. The receptionist who answered sounded skeptical when I explained that I'd found evidence related to stolen Nazi loot, probably figuring I was another elderly crank with conspiracy theories and too much time on my hands. But she transferred me to Agent Sarah Collins, who listened patiently as I explained what I'd found, asking detailed questions that suggested she knew more about such cases than I'd expected. To my surprise, she asked if I could drive up that afternoon, explaining that the Bureau still had open files related to stolen cultural artifacts from World War II, and that Harold's documentation might be exactly what they needed to close some cases that had been cold for decades. The drive to Omaha took 2 hours, Rex riding beside me with his head out the window, both of us nervous about what we were walking into but committed to seeing it through. Agent Collins was about my daughter's age, professional and kind, and she treated Harold's evidence with the respect it deserved, handling each photograph and document like it was made of glass. What happened next changed everything about how people saw me in Millfield, transforming me from the town's slightly eccentric old mechanic into someone who'd helped solve what the newspapers see. One of the longest-running art theft cases in FBI history. The investigation that followed Harold's evidence led to the recovery of 7 major art pieces and dozens of smaller items from 3 different families, including the Whitmores, who suddenly found themselves explaining how they'd acquired a 15th-century painting that had belonged to a Jewish family in Munich. The newspaper coverage was extensive, with reporters from Omaha and Lincoln wanting to interview the mechanic who solved a 70-year-old mystery. But I tried to keep the focus on Harold and the families who were finally getting their heritage back, understanding that this wasn't really about me or my detective work, but about justice that had been delayed for most of a lifetime. The reporters seemed disappointed that I didn't have more dramatic stories about the discovery, that I couldn't provide them with the kind of exciting narrative they wanted for their articles. One elderly woman flew in from Germany to reclaim a painting of her grandmother that had hung in the Whitmore's dining room for 50 years. When she saw it for the first time since she was a child, she broke down crying, touching the frame with trembling fingers while she told me about the night the Nazis had come to take her family away, how her father had hidden this painting behind a false wall but hadn't been able to retrieve it before they were forced to leave. When she hugged me and thanked me in broken English, Rex seemed to understand the importance of the moment, sitting perfectly still beside us while tears ran down both our faces. The same people who'd laughed at me and Rex at the county auction were now stopping by the garage to hear the story, to see the old truck that had held such secrets for so many years. Some of them apologized for their earlier comments, but I didn't hold grudges. I understood that respect had to be earned, and sometimes it came in ways you never expected. The FBI gave me a commendation for citizen service, and the local historical society asked me to speak at their monthly meeting about Harold's role in preserving cultural heritage during one of history's darkest periods. But the real reward was knowing that families separated from their history by one of humanity's most systematic attempts at cultural destruction were finally being made whole again, at least in small ways. Letters started arriving from around the world, from children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who'd heard about the recovery of their families' belongings. Each letter told a story of loss and hope, of heritage preserved against impossible odds, of the importance of objects that carried memories across generations and continents. Rex lived 3 more years after that discovery, long enough to see the garden behind our garage bloom with flowers sent by grateful families from around the world, long enough to watch me find purpose again in stories that mattered more than fixing engines or maintaining my reputation in a small town. He got to meet some of the people who came to thank us in person, families who made pilgrimages to Millfield to see the truck that had preserved their heritage and to shake hands with the dog who'd known something was hidden there. When he passed quietly one autumn morning, I buried him next to Margaret under the oak tree they'd both loved, with a headstone that read, Rex, who knew when to listen and when to lead. I kept Harold's truck, restored it properly this time with attention to every detail, and it runs like new. Sometimes I drive it to the cemetery and tell them both about the letters I still get from families whose heritage Harold helped preserve, about the young FBI agents who have started consulting me on similar cases, about the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've helped right an old wrong. The funny thing about respect is that once you earn it the right way, through truth and courage and doing what's right regardless of the personal cost, it changes how you see yourself as much as how others see you. I'm still the same 76-year-old mechanic I was before Rex found Harold's secrets, still getting grease under my fingernails and helping neighbors fix their problems, but now I understand that some discoveries are worth more than the sum of their parts. Harold's legacy wasn't just about returning stolen treasures to their families. It was about the reminder that ordinary people can be part of something extraordinary, that loyalty and perseverance and paying attention to what matters can change lives decades after the original events. The garage is busier now than it's been in years, not just because of the publicity, but because people have started bringing me problems that go beyond mechanical repair. They bring me boxes found in attics, documents discovered in old houses, mysteries that need patient investigation rather than quick fixes. I've become the person you go to when you find something that doesn't make sense, when you need someone who understands that the most important discoveries often come wrapped in ordinary packages, hidden in plain sight until someone with the right combination of curiosity and courage decides to look closer. Have you ever found something that completely changed your understanding of someone you thought you knew? Maybe it was letters in an attic, or documents in an old desk, or just a conversation that revealed depths you never suspected. I'd love to hear your story, because I've learned that these moments of discovery, these times when the past reaches out to reshape the present, connect us all in ways we never expect. Sometimes the most important inheritances aren't the ones listed in wills, but the ones we uncover through patience, courage, and the wisdom to know when something matters more than our own comfort.